surrounding, at least initially, the Foreign Agents Law, and then broadening as a protest against the fixed elections in fall 2024. They have prepared two PowerPoint presentations for us today. So I'm going to introduce everybody initially and then give them the floor. We're going to be collecting Q&A questions out via the Q&A button. So please go ahead and log in your questions, and then I will coordinate the Q&A session at the end of their presentations. So in order, our first speaker will be Tamta Khalvashi, who is a professor of anthropology and the head of the PhD program in social and cultural anthropology at Elias State University. Our second speaker is Nutsa Batiashvili, who is also a professor of anthropology. She is at the Free University of Tbilisi. Our third speaker is Luka Nakhutsrishvili, who teaches critical theory at Elias State in Tbilisi and also is a project coordinator at the Institute of Social and Cultural Research at Elias State. And finally, our last speaker is Eradze, who is a political economist who focuses on economic development, central banking, and Georgia's financial history. She is a fellow and associate professor at GIPA, the Georgian Institute for Public Affairs. I don't want to slow us down any further because I think this is a critical and crucial conversation that we're going to have. So Tamta, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Julie, for this great introduction, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this event today. We're really very pleased to have this opportunity to talk about Georgia, especially in this framework of the Democracy in Crisis and Transformation lecture series, which I know is being now organized at the Harriman Institute of Columbia University. So because of that invitation, I'm also thankful to Valentina Izmirleva for including this panel on Georgia in this lecture series, and for her unwavering support and interest in Georgia, the country which is navigating one of the most turbulent chapters maybe in its recent history. And I also would like to thank you, Julie, for kindly agreeing to moderate this panel. It's the first time we meet here, and it's an honor to have you here to guide our conversation. And we look forward to this dialogue. So first, let me start by a general introduction to what you can expect from today's panel. Because this panel combines kind of interdisciplinary expertise in anthropology, cultural studies, political economy, with our own lived experiences to discuss Georgia's current political crisis and mass resistance, which is ongoing. And in this way, we want to draw your attention to the kind of more grounded and nuanced understanding of the ongoing situation in Georgia, because as scholars kind of deeply embedded in this resistance against an increasingly authoritarian, fascist, and oppressive regime of the current Georgian Dream government, we see it as our duty somehow to share the story from within, from Georgia. Because too often what we see also in mainstream international media and academic discourse is that either we have this absence of first-hand or embodied perspectives about Georgia, or worse, there are also narratives that completely distort the reality on the ground. So what we aim here is to decentralize the knowledge about our country, and somehow, and hopefully we will manage to do this, and to amplify the voices of those who live this struggle and this resistance on a daily basis. The kind of the general argument of our panel is that we want to focus how, in the name of sovereignty, peace, and geopolitics, the current Georgian government, which is led by the Georgian Dream Party, is consolidating its oppressive, authoritarian, and anti-democratic regime. And perhaps this is one of the most crucial arguments of our panel today, that autocratic regimes instrumentalize geopolitical ambiguities, which we know that current global world is kind of covered with that. And also they instrumentalize fears of war or troubled sovereignty to justify their increasingly anti-democratic rule. So I think this is the main argument of the entire panel, and we see this process as part of the broader reactionary right-wing shift in global politics, which basically seeks to scapegoat civil or political society, independent media, and marginal communities in the name of defending their own nations. So in the panel, we will also explore how people deal with such politics in Georgia, where the government has been using extremely violent measures against its citizens recently, which is being reinforced on daily basis, basically by repressive legislative changes. So let me, by this general introduction, now I will move to my own talk and maybe more kind of focused talk on the protests, street protests in Georgia. And I will start by saying that today marks the 84th consecutive day of protest, non-stop protest against the Georgian government, which has been unprecedented in the country's history. So with this in mind, I would like to share a short video from one of the most recent protests in Tbilisi, unfolding daily on the city's central Rustaveli Avenue. With this video, I also would like to invite you to step together into the protest atmosphere so that you may sense the affective landscape of this mass resistance, which is ongoing in Georgia. Okay, so this video, which you just saw, captures the 71st day of the resistance in Georgia that has spread nationwide against this increasingly authoritarian government. And it captures a moment of blocking the Rustaveli Avenue in Tbilisi, a space which has recently transformed into a stage of kind of embodied resistance. This particular scene demonstrates how the protesters are driven by the rhythmic flow of their bodies moving in unison, basically from different sides, expressing collective dissent. Protesters, and you may have noticed also both human and non-human, such as stray dogs, which are kind of which have very active presence in this current protest, occupy the avenue daily, this main avenue, asserting their presence through movement, gesture, and sound, without any centralized political leadership. Instead, this kind of resistance is emerging daily in Georgia from the diffused power and relational encounters between different segments of society. The protest's very form conveys its central message, an insistence on presence, on occupying space, and sustaining resistance through a sheer act of being there. In this sense, this Rustaveli Avenue is more than a location today. It is a space of resistance shaped by bodies who move or block within it. So let me move to the explanation of what it means. This is a headless protest. It doesn't have political leaders, and it's part of this broader wave of grassroots resistance in Georgia, which erupted on November 28, following the government's announcement of the termination of Georgia's EU integration. And this statement was made right after the rigged elections of October 26, so 1 month later. However, I have to underline that the energy fueling this resistance had been accumulating for nearly 2 years, and even more, but I will focus on those 2 years. And it reflects the broader crisis of legitimacy faced by the Georgian Dream government. The roots of this resistance can be traced back to March 2023, when mass protests erupted against, already Julie mentioned, the proposed so-called Foreign Agents Bill. And this bill was is modeled on a similar bill in Russia, which regards any non-governmental organization or media outlet funded by the West as threatening Georgia's sovereignty and national security. The instrumentalization of fears about traitors or agents undermining the country's sovereignty from within with the help of external powers has been the prevalent genre of Georgian nationalism. And actually, Nutsa has written about it quite extensively in her recent article in History and Anthropology. She talks about agents and then traitors in a very interesting way. But for the first time in Georgia's recent history, the bill targeted the West, not Russia, as the sole underminer of the country's sovereignty. Protests of 2023 were thus driven mainly by anti-imperial anger, claiming that Georgian government was itself a traitor, aligning with Russia to consolidate its power, authoritarian power. The protesters therefore demonstrated with slogans presented on this slide that Georgia was not just part of Europe, but was itself Europe, a home where it had to return. In my work, I have explored extensively this trope of return to Europe as Georgia's powerful national narrative. Based on various mythological, historical, and archaeological pieces of evidence, the Georgian national narrative has indeed been marked by this unique national imagination in the Caucasus regarding Georgia not as just part of Europe, but as the originator of Europe. And I won't go deep into this because it will take us very far. Apart from many problematic aspects that the returning to Europe narrative entails, or Europe going back to home entails, what it continually embodied in Georgia has been the impulse to survive. And this is crucial because Georgia has this legacy of being thwarted by Russian colonialism, Soviet annexation, and post-Soviet Russian occupation. And this kind of idea of Europe has secured the hopes to defend countries' troubled sovereignty on the edge of the violent Russian Empire. But what it also has done, and maybe more importantly for me and for this group of presenters, is that it also embodied a desire to guarantee the country's democracy, justice, and freedom. So the Foreign Agents Bill introduced by Georgian Dream government in 2023, which was then withdrawn actually and later passed in April 2024, was thus perceived by the Georgian public to jeopardize the very premise of sovereignty of the country it claimed to defend. Because it was apparent to protesters that not only was Georgia's European future at stake, but the very foundations of democracy and justice were at stake in Georgia. So the ongoing resistance in Georgia must be seen against this complex background. It is not just a reaction to recent geopolitical shift in the region, but as a continuation of a long-standing desire for a democratic society. But what makes this resistance unique today is that the opposition parties supporting the protest stay behind the scenes, as they do not have enough legitimacy in the protesters, among the protesters, to represent the various voices which are involved in these protests. So in this way, people mobilize through professional networks like education, and you can see on the slide also Georgian education under threat, through such professional networks as theater and cinema or civil service, or they also mobilize through their shared concerns, which has been imposed by the government over the years, such as, for example, debts or working conditions, and etc. So by organizing these different informal groups and professional groups, by organizing different marches in the city, they collectively refuse to accept a system that seeks to silence its citizens, not least with very, very sheer violence. To this end, protesters have two main demands: to appoint new elections and release political prisoners captured during this mass resistance. However, the Georgian Dream government continues to react violently by arresting or fining the protesters almost every day. Yet, the more violently the government responds, the more angrily the protesters react to it by continuing to occupy streets and insisting on their demands. They even created chants such as "police everywhere, justice nowhere, no justice, no peace, unjust court, fear the power of the people, people demand justice," or "fire to oligarchy," spreading across the country as a powerful language of resistance. Let me just play this video and then continue as well. This is just to illustrate how these chants, which have been created by different groups of people, by actually particular group of protesters, are chanted every day on the Rustaveli Avenue when they block the street. And then the people kind of gather together and they together start chanting this. And it has become a very powerful language of resistance, which is now spreading across the country. So in this way, the violence that has been kind of really strongly used against the protesters in Georgia had kind of the opposite effect in this country. Instead of being threatened, the protesters are infuriated even more, prompting them to continue to resist through various informal solidarity networks. As I already mentioned, these networks are marked by the absence of any political leadership. And I think although at some point some kind of organized politics will have to enter the protest field, and it will enter, and it started to kind of infiltrate it, for now, the protesters' apolitical stance somehow, filled with anger and sometimes even shame, creates the condition for new politics rather than for the version of old game. And I want to kind of now come to the conclusion by saying that actually when I'm standing among the varied segments of protesters, I often hear a familiar phrase, which is, it's a shame, sirtchvilia in Georgian. It's a common phrase used in Georgia widely to criticize not just the government for its unfulfilled promises, but also to articulate the felt experience that those in power impose on its citizens. Indeed, for various segments of society, it feels humiliating to live in an increasingly undemocratic, violent, and authoritarian state. Thus, protesters sometimes appeal to those who stay silent in this context due to fear or support toward the government to feel ashamed. And by doing so, they confront them with the moral implications of their positions in the face of growing authoritarianism. And though the danger of shame is that it may part ways and end mutual understanding between people, in my forthcoming book with the title Peripheral Shame, I argue that this shame is also the basis for social coexistence, carving the way for possible political change. Because indeed, as it has been theorized by different authors, that shame has the potential to question and reevaluate previous political orders, and it can prompt a broader political struggle to transform community. And what I see, at least in Georgia right now, is that protesters in Georgia are engaged in this profoundly political practice of confronting, persuading, and reconnecting with their fellow citizens through shame, refusing to let fabricated divisions define the country. This is just my final note that I wanted to make, and now I will let Nutsa continue her presentation. I think I've used time, and yes, I'm sorry if I'm running out of my own allocated time. So Nutsa Batiashvili will be the next speaker who will tell us more about her recent research on how the Georgian Dream government, in the name of peace, actually, in this case, instrumentalizes fears and anxieties about the possible war in Georgia. And Nutsa will tell us more about it. Thank you.
Slides. I want to thank the organizers, Tamta. It was in charge of this, so thank you for coordinating this. And I'm very pleased to be here. This is a really, indeed, an important opportunity for us to give you an insider's perspective. My part of the talk actually goes back in time a little bit. So I will attempt to lay out specifically what kind of anxieties and fears were at work during the 2024 elections. And we'll try to focus on this effectively layered work of the propaganda machine in the pre-election campaign.
Wait.
So my comments, I'll say this before Tamta opens the slides. I'm not seeing the slides. Does anyone, is it me or?
Chance, Nutsa, chance.
მე ვერ ხედავ, ანუ?
პირველ slides-ზე ვარ.
Yeah, I'm not seeing.
The slides are visible. It's probably your screen. You're on the front Zoom screen, but there's a second Zoom screen.
Oh, Tamta screen. Okay, I'm seeing it. Okay, I clicked on something. I'm sorry. So my comments here are based on the data that comes from this nationwide experimental study. And this is part of the larger project exploring the relationship between memory and anxiety. It's also an interdisciplinary project that comes kind of is a branch out of all the anxiety projects that I've done, and involves psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists. We studied pre-election anxieties in 3 countries as of now to see how anticipation of threats in times of crisis, or what we sometimes call decisive elections, which we had kind of both in Turkey and Georgia and the United States most recently, how these anticipated threats are tied to collective memories. Next slide, please. So in Georgia, in parallel to this almost uninterrupted cycle of pro-European protests geared toward combating the turn to authoritarianism, as Tamta brilliantly described, the Georgian Dream pre-election propaganda capitalized on the promise of peace and stability in the face of the palpable threats of war. And some of you might have seen these banners that were all throughout the city that outraged part of the public. Now, the curious thing about the ruling party's tactic was that they invoked fear of Russia without actually naming Russia or its leaders as aggressors. Instead, everyone else, including the West, the Global War Party, the deep state and its local agents of chaos, which were the protesters and the opposition parties, were in their narratives dragging Georgia into the war. Next slide, please. The threat of instability, though, was intricately woven into their techniques of exerting pressure on the local levels, especially in these invisible corners of the country. They weaponized the promise of instability in a way that used economic vulnerability, social insecurity, and entrenched forms of authority in their favor. In this region that I study, in Highland Svaneti, for instance, the coercive state apparatus, apart from the kinds of pressure that are more visible, channeled its pressure through the village authorities. And as the threats were felt and enacted in the local communities to kind of secure silent consent. You see now this excerpt from the conversation that was shared with me by my co-ethnographer that took place as part of the village council that gathered to decide who the village as a collective was going to vote for. And it may give you some idea as the village authority, that is the church guardian, kind of gives a command in a way why the village should vote for the ruling party. And you see some resistance there in this conversation, but in the end, the pressure worked. So that was the result of the vote. And I'm giving you a milder example of exerting pressure, which is now, it seems, is in the past. We now have moved into the era of a very direct intimidation and oppression tactics from the ruling party. Next. So this is just to give you some ethnographic and broader context for what we did. There still was, in the pre-election period, some hope in this kind of anticipatory moment prior to the elections, along with a lot of anxiety that things could change. So in our study, we wanted to see where the concerns people had in anticipation of the 2 possible scenarios. So one scenario was, this was the first condition of the experimental study, was that Georgian Dream, what happens if Georgian Dream wins the elections, and another scenario was the opposition win. This is just to give you the idea how the study was designed. We had about 800 participants. Each one got only one scenario, and they had to imagine what would come next. And the second experimental condition looked at what were the national memories people associated with those concerns and threats that they had for the future. We had 800 something participants from all regions of Georgia, all the ages and age ranges and gender. But even in the study, we saw the ramifications of this atmosphere of fear and terror in the survey responses as well. There are many examples, but I remember this one participant who was trying to answer the question on collective memory conditions. So she or he started, for 30 years, we're circling on the same wheel, and then they kind of cut the sentence short saying, if my name is recorded somewhere, delete it. And we could see the hesitation to respond to some questions that really reflected the sense of pressure that people felt in the pre-election period. But I want to give you now some idea, next slide, please, about the main themes that we saw emerge when people tried to imagine possible danger. Luka and Iya's parts will give more flesh to these kind of schematic descriptions that I'm laying out here. I just want you to see what was out there on the national scale. We coded about 9 big themes that involved threats of joining EU, economic crisis, and so forth, and across the entire data. The largest ones were related to the anticipated problems with the West. This included sanctions, revoking of visa liberalization, and the threat to EU integration. This threat was mainly associated with the scenario of Georgian Dream party winning the elections. Another largest theme was, of course, economic crisis, and I won't go into much detail. But the danger of, Iya's comments will give you some better idea, I think, on this. But one of the biggest themes, of course, was danger of war, and not only war with Russia, but the danger of civil war. The slides are jumping now on their own, but this was civil war and internal turmoil. We coded these two separately for the sake of accuracy, but you see in this data is the diverse language for describing simultaneity of internal and external chaos. So people feared not only war with Russia, but the internal war, civil war, civil confrontation that was described in many, many ways. What threatens Georgian sovereignty? Could you go to the previous ones? I don't know why it's moving on its own. So what threatens Georgian sovereignty in the eyes of the public is largely tied to Russia, of course. We saw about 10 times less instances of fearing meddling of the West into internal affairs as a risk to sovereignty than Russian pressure or aggression. And this is how the threats were distributed. So you see the disparity in case of the different scenarios. But on a larger scale, people felt anxious that the country's future is in danger. And even for those who couldn't name the threat initially, the current context invoked the memories of wars and frictions. So we had a big number of people, about 40%, who refused to name or couldn't name what danger or threat they anticipated in case of the opposition or the ruling party's win. But when we looked at the data, the same people who couldn't name the threat recalled memories of wars and civil confrontations and aggressions from Russia and so forth, as for them kind of associated with the current context or with their anticipations. And this is, of course, tied to the, for us, to the collective memory. So we looked into what was there out there that people remembered. I'm slides
I'm anxious. Slide,
the next one.
Okay.
Yes, this one. So what people remembered, and the war had this was interesting, that we had disparity in 2 scenarios, what kind of threats people imagined in case of opposition or the ruling party win, but we had almost identical collective memory results in both scenarios. So irrespective of who people imagined could win the elections, they recalled predominantly wars and internal turmoil and turbulences from the Georgia's recent and sometimes not so recent past. And this was evidently tied the fears that were activated and reawakened by the propaganda machine, kind of touched on the trauma of the Georgia's 1990s wars, Tbilisi War in particular, the ethno-territorial wars as well, but also 2008 Russian-Georgian War, and perhaps larger regional conflicts, because we had a lot of participants just saying, I'm just remembering wars, and I didn't specify which ones. So what people recalled gave away much about the kind of implicit work of the propaganda machine. There were a lot of political opinion polls conducted by the think tanks in Georgia that showed that the fear of war propaganda worked only on 30% of the voters. What we saw through this experimental study was kind of a slightly different picture, that even when these fears are not directly articulated, you see their implicit work in different ways that people feel the pressure. And this is probably one of the most cruel weapons deployed in these elections, one of using people's traumas to suppress the possibility of free choice. So I'll end at that. I think I just wanted to give you the scale of the nationwide picture, in a way, what effectively layered kind of narratives and images were out there prior to the elections. And I think Luka's and Ia's parts will give more flesh and more substance to these. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nutsa. And Luka, hopefully you're sharing your Great. And just to, as it gets started, as Luka pulls that up, just to remind everybody who's attending, please do add any questions or comments that you would like the panelists to consider in our Q&A. I see. Thank you, Magnus, for starting it off. Feel free to do that, and we will then attend to these in a Q&A session. Thank you, Luka. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for the initiative. Yeah, it's very hard to be speaking about these things from the midst of what you're experiencing, but I will basically start from where Nutsa left us off and try to provide a brief overview of how Georgian Dream propaganda uses geopolitics as a sort of opium to make people forget about local problems or even to justify authoritarian violence. Because since the past 2 years, what you see in Georgian media is the proliferation of so-called experts in geopolitics who might not be voicing outright support for Georgian Dream, but what is common to all of them is that they all instill in the public a profound sense of disempowerment in the face of all the big global players negotiating over the head of a small country like Georgia. And the basic message is that there's nothing Georgians can do to change the course of things, hence we'd better keep quiet to not get caught in the crossfire. Even if Georgian Dream isn't the most perfect government, they are at least going with the world historical flow, and the globe is shifting towards a multipolar order. The EU is declining anyway. They're not as democratic as they claim after all. So we'd better stick to ourselves and not let anyone teach us any lessons. And this is where you see a perverse kind of pride being cultivated with the help of an entire network of social and traditional media tools in compensation for all the passivity and sense of rationalized powerlessness that the propaganda instills. This media ecosystem fosters the conviction that the conditionalities, for example, put forward by the European Union for Georgia's further rapprochement with the EU amounts to foreign interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign country. But these conditions include demands to ensure the independence of crucial state institutions such as the judiciary, the anti-corruption bureau, the apparatus, basically everything that Georgia urgently needs, regardless of any EU framework. But the problem for Georgian Dream, of course, is that fulfilling these conditions would amount to its losing its absolute grip on power. Yet, because Georgian Dream is unable to reject Georgia's European path altogether due to the population's solid support for EU membership, what they try to do is to twist the entire issue of conditionalities. They insist that it's insulting to Georgians' pride to be confronted with conditions in the first place, as if we weren't good enough the way we are. And the message is, accept us the way we are with our specific characteristics, or just leave us alone. This rhetoric of dignity and pride was very much present in the election campaign, where Georgian Dream's main slogan was towards Europe, but only with peace, prosperity, and dignity. And they were certainly not entirely dishonest about moving towards Europe, regardless of all the hindrances they had artificially interposed on Georgia's accession path, be it the foreign agents law or the anti-LGBT law, which the EU considered incompatible with its human rights standards. I would also suggest that the Prime Minister wasn't lying either when he suspended EU talks until 2028, because the expectation is that by 2028, the EU itself will be dominated by powers like Orban, Le Pen, AfD, etc., who are opposed to the very idea of democratic reforms and conditionalities with which the EU currently confronts Georgia. And it is this other Europe of the far-right conservatives that to which the Georgian Dream aspires, basically. For Georgian Dream, this would mean the ultimate triumph of the multipolar world of authoritarian powers, finally leaving it to exert its arbitrary rule without anyone putting forward normative demands regarding human rights violations or anything like that. Now, for all of Georgian Dream's talk about sovereignty and its anti-colonialist pathos, ultimately, their entire politics looks completely self-colonizing vis-a-vis this other far-right West that they like so much. Given that Biden's administration denied to recognize the legitimacy of the rigged parliamentary elections, since Trump's victory, Georgian Dream strategy has been to wait for Trump, which means sitting out the crisis that has been ravaging Georgia by focusing on foreign policy, basically. Thus, for example, on December the 1st, Georgian Prime Minister, Georgian Dream's Prime Minister, famously declared, whatever Trump will say will be. So that's so much for your sovereignty and national pride. And I call this politics of waiting for Trump in echo to Tamta's conceptual apparatus, peripheral Trumpism. It's the politics of a peripheral authoritarian government trying to compensate for its ailing domestic and international legitimacy by parasitically mimicking Trump's or Elon Musk's discourse, which serves two main goals. On the one hand, by communicating with its own electorate, every single phrase tweeted or pronounced by Trump or Musk, Georgian Dream can claim that Trump is their guy, their own guy, and that he is doing and saying what Georgian Dream has been claiming all along, including anti-gender measures, dismantling the separation of powers, disbanding USAID, and the firing of non-loyalist, non-partisan public servants. And all of this in the name of serving the true interests of the true people, without the mediation or the meddle of technocrats or alien forces. Trump's administration showing their ideological affinity in the hope that Trump will someday recognize the election results and lift the sanctions imposed on Georgian Dream officials. And this politics of waiting for Trump comes in different guises and caters to different publics. For one, there emerged a certain Kimberly Lowe, a political non-entity, basically, a MAGA Republican who ran for election to the US Senate, but was disqualified already from the 22 Republican primary due to incomplete paperwork. And in an interview with Lowe in December, one of the propaganda channels presented her as Trump's future special envoy to the EU. And she seemed to assure Georgian Dream's confused electorate that after January 20th, Trump's policies would help Georgian Dream restore its relations with the West. But it very soon turned out that Kimberly Lowe any official position. Another even more authoritative voice hailing from the West was the renowned economist Jeffrey Sachs. In an interview aired on the main propaganda channel in December, Sachs reiterated basically all of his talking points about the US having pushed Ukraine and Georgia into conflict with Russia. He kindly advised us to forget the West and engage in economic cooperation with all the other regional or global powers. He completely sidelined the question of Georgia's struggle for democracy and reduced the current resistance to nothing more than yet another US-staged operation. So this curious MAGA politician and the renowned scholar represent different versions of the Western savior, basically, who in their respective ways are supposed to help Georgian Dream to sit through the waiting period until Trump will actually have lifted sanctions and recognized Georgian Dream as the legitimate government. But since January 20th, the propaganda channels have been flooding us with those quotes from Trump and Musk that directly echo Georgian Dream's own rhetoric. However, for now, Trump and Musk seem to have little interest in recognizing in Georgian Dream the kind of ideological ally, the same way they aggressively partner up with the far-right forces in Western Europe or Orban. Georgian Dream, although it shares the same ideological rhetoric and everything, doesn't seem to come into question when it comes to such alliances. The only thing that Georgian Dream seems to have obtained so far is that, particularly in light of the rhetoric and policies that Trump has been enforcing since his inauguration, it is Georgian Dream is fully enjoying the return, so to say, on its having betted everything on the Trumpist card before the elections in Georgia as well as in the US. Ultimately, this entire propaganda is meant to keep the more passive segment of the population demobilized as they are. As for the rebellious part of the population, Georgian Dream has brutal police force and repressive laws at its disposal. In fact, Georgian Dream feels so fragile that they react very sensitively to every single act of disrespect, which is why, besides having banned masks, lasers, and fireworks from demonstrations, they have criminalized insulting politicians. But even if nowadays the protests aren't as massive as they were in December, for example, there's still a considerable amount of people ready to defy all these repressive legal amendments, like they did 2 days ago when we had the birthday of the ruling oligarch. Protesters celebrated it with a true carnival, with a really spectacular display of lack of deference to those in power. And the public space overall remains dominated by the symbols and sounds of protest, which is why repression is Georgian Dream's only option, all the more so as nobody from among its own supporters seem willing to stage proper counter-protests and even less to engage in as enduring a political mobilization as shown by the participants of the resistance movement. Because it seems that Georgian Dream's what one could call anti-politics, right? Its manipulation of geopolitics ultimately backfired and left its supporters completely demobilized, so that it becomes impossible to mobilize them when it's necessary, right? And the police force is basically the only segment of society that you see on the streets who represent Georgian Dream or who support it. So there is this complete discrepancy between the extremely strong 53% of votes that Georgian Dream claims it received last October and the actual political energy that his supporters display, or I could say rather the complete lack of such energy. Meanwhile, protesters look for new ways of organizing and building more resilient forms of resistance, such as establishing trade unions, founding new political movements, contributing to strike funds, etc. And it's quite impressive that they continue to resist and to stay confident about their agency against all odds, despite the consuming fear of war that they share with GD supporters, as Nutsa elaborated. And this determination looks even more impressive in the face of the cataclysmic shifts in the global balance of power that Trump's and Vance's most recent scandalous moves have triggered. So yeah, let's see where this will lead us, and I'll just stop here and pass the floor to Iya. Thank you.
Thank you, Luka.
Let me share Iya's presentation.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yes, I will not lose time until Luka is trying to share the presentation. Well, hello everyone, and thanks from my side too for this opportunity to be speaking at this panel on the ongoing struggle and process in Georgia. And well, my input will be reflecting actually also on what my colleagues have already talked about, but my aim is in particular to kind of zoom in a bit more into the instrumentalization of sovereignty discourse by the Georgian Dream, because the main idea or the main argument of my short input today is to argue that, well, basically this topic of regaining or protecting and defending sovereignty really turned into a very important weapon in the hand of Georgian Dream to consolidate authoritarianism in Georgia. And this is why we think this is such an important topic. As Tamta also already talked about in the very beginning, the Georgian Dream started to talk about regaining sovereignty already before the elections, and it's right now very hard to say the exact timeline because this is something that needs to be further researched, but it definitely started as late as maybe or as early as 2020 and then onwards, and also after the 24 elections. And this narrative was immediately linked with the idea of arguing how the Western countries, the EU countries, and also the USA were interfering into Georgian politics way too much, how this was creating threats for the Georgian traditions, how EU and USA were forcing the Georgian government to do certain things and blaming even the Western countries that they were pushing the Georgian government to open the second front against Russia. And here they also talked about the global war party, the kind of the construct that they invented. And so in a way, creating all these discourse and narratives, which it turned out to be a very powerful tool for this propaganda machine. And the idea of protecting sovereignty didn't end in going against these Western forces interfering into Georgian politics, but also fighting against the foreign local agents, maybe we can say, who were in the Georgian civil society. So here the government was targeting different NGOs, but also media or academics, and this still goes on. And one of the key reasons why the Georgian Dream was doing this was, first of all, that they could justify this shift of the foreign policy, which always in the Georgian history and also since the independence of 1991, need to be used very pro-Western. Now the Georgian Dream started to project kind of alternative geopolitical scenarios scenarios, how Georgia would do better if it would align more with countries like China or Russia or even Iran. And also, as I already said earlier, they wanted to legitimize the authoritarian rule within the country, as they would chase all kinds of what they called foreign agents, also through this well-known foreign agent law. Next slide, please, Luka. And there are two claims that I want to make here, so to show why I would say that it is totally not plausible that the party like the Georgian Dream, or the government that is led by the Georgian Dream, that they do not really have any legitimacy to talk about sovereignty, or even to talk about regaining or protecting sovereignty, because it is the very Georgian Dream that has contributed to the weakening of Georgia's sovereignty over the last 12 years. And by now, their so-called strive for sovereignty has very weak political and economic base. And secondly, it is very problematic when Georgian Dream, led and founded by the oligarch Ivanishvili, they mention over and over this idea of sovereignty. It is not legitimate because Ivanishvili himself, he perceives the Georgian state as his own possession, and he also accordingly understands the defense of sovereignty as a protection of himself and his elites and their interests. So this is very problematic. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, what I understand when I am talking about sovereignty. That when we refer to sovereignty, maybe it's important to say that here it's not meant only how the state can control its territory, so the control over territory, but also control over economy and money. And this is why I'm saying that this political economic base of Georgia's sovereignty as a peripheral country is already weak, and it has been weakened even further under Georgian Dream rule. And I will explain this a bit later. And we could talk about maybe legal, geopolitical and economic dimensions of sovereignty. And of course, what is important is to observe how states exercise power internally, but also externally when they engage in regional or global politics and structures. And as for the understanding of the sovereignty, more the conceptual part of it, here I draw on Wendy Brown, who says that it's actually not just the Schmitten power to decide on exceptions or only popular sovereignty, but it's a combination of both. That sovereignty can be seen to work, quoting Brown here, in a double register, one of routine legitimacy, law and elections, but also another of state action or decisionism. And this is what I argue that what we also see in case of the Georgian Dream. Next slide. So to go back to the first of these two claims that I presented earlier, that that sovereignty, or political and economic sovereignty of Georgia as a peripheral country is very fragile. Here I want to dwell a bit more on this, and also to argue that it was also the very Georgian Dream, who, I mean, they have been in power already for 12 years, that they have not contributed much to make Georgia a bit more sovereign in political or economic terms. As probably known to our audience today, the political sovereignty or territorial sovereignty of Georgia is very much distorted, because 20% of the country is occupied by Russia. And also when it comes to the what I call here economic sovereignty of the country here, this is also very fragile, because Georgia has a peripheral economy. It very much depends on foreign capital, foreign direct investments, and also foreign debt. Basically, the whole economic development model of Georgia would collapse if there was not the constant inflow of foreign direct investments or remittances sent by Georgian immigrants, or if the Georgian government was not borrowing extensively from different Western countries or also different multilateral development banks to finance different projects. More importantly, perhaps, the economic sovereignty of Georgia is distorted also when it comes to the presence of the Russian capital and high concentration of the Russian capital in strategically important areas of the Georgian state and economy. And what I mean by that is the presence of the Russian capital in areas like energy, water supply, and also natural resources. The rights over natural resources in Georgia, they are in the hands of Russian businessmen who are then on their own terms connected to the oligarchic structures in Russia. And lastly, it is also very important to mention here that the large parts of the Georgian population, and maybe Luka, you can switch to the next slide, is very much vulnerable in socioeconomic terms because the rate of poverty is rather high. And if we look at the rates of relative poverty, for example, it has been more or less constant over the last 10 or 15 years, above 20%. The income inequality is also very high, and in the last 3 or 4 years, it has been even increasing. And we have a huge outflow of Georgians. So these are basically economic emigrants who emigrate to different European or non-European countries to survive. And then and also I would add here that by now almost 20% of the Georgian population, they receive the so-called social assistance from the Georgian state. So they are directly tied to the state structures on the central and also on community and city and village levels. And such vulnerable population economically and socially, they are very easy, unfortunately, very easy to be repressed by government, so that they have fear of the government, how they vote, who they vote for, whether they will lose their social assistance, and so on and so forth. And this is also connected to the fears what Nutsa was talking about. And this is the situation that after 12 years, because 12 years is really not little time, the Georgian Dream is responsible for creating such a social and economic situation within the country. Next slide, please. And then going back again to the second claim, where I argued that there is really sovereignty without sovereignty, because there is also a huge mismatch how the Georgian government understands sovereignty and how I, from the position of a researcher, I would understand sovereignty even as a mix of the power of making exceptions and popular sovereignty, because the oligarch Ivanishvili, he basically sees the whole country as his possession, and he of course has very strong economic power, and not only he himself as one person, but also the major economic and political elites who are also very often inseparable in Georgia, including also some other big businesses and middle part of the middle class in Georgia, who have become rich because of the development project that the government has been offering them to implement. This is the interest of the oligarch and his elite, so to say. It turns out to outweigh the public interest, unfortunately. And in Georgia, very often now people talk about how the whole country and the political economic pathway and future of the country has in a way become a hostage of this authoritarian regime and of Ivanishvili himself, because the Georgian Dream has unfortunately managed to seize and take over all the major state institutions by now, and including also major production forces. And this is why when the Georgian Dream talks about regaining or defending or protecting sovereignty from the external Western actors or the Georgian foreign agents, this basically means for them protection for the oligarchic regime and their interests, so that they do not experience any pressure from outside or within Georgia to create democratic structures and foster just development. And the next slide, which is also the last one. Well, besides and despite the picture that I provided here, how the Georgian Dream has been using and weaponizing this whole discourse of regaining sovereignty and deploying it through its very powerful propaganda machine, I think we can still talk about here that the hegemony of the Georgian Dream at the end is rather weak. And this was also what Luka was talking about in his last part of the talk, that even though the Georgian Dream, they do control the large parts of the production forces and the state institutions, still their popular support from within the population, it's very low, it's very weak, it's based on the fear, basically, and the police is the major force that their hegemony is based on right now. So I would allow myself here to say that this hegemony and this structure that we are facing now, this oligarchic structure, is also quite shaking at this moment, because the agents, and especially the local agents within Georgia, they have turned out to be rather stubborn. And as Tamta was saying in the very beginning, the protests have been going on already almost 3 months, non-stop, and we might be witnessing soon something like the dislocation of the structure or structural dislocation, where these agents, these active agents, will have more space and more possibilities to make a change. And I would end here on this rather optimistic note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ia, and thank you everyone on the panel for providing the insights and the findings of your ongoing work. That's super exciting stuff, and I'm really excited to see it in print. We have a couple questions in the Q&A. So the first thing I'm going to do is encourage our audience to ask more questions, and then. So I'm going to start with the questions in the Q&A, the first two, and then I'm going to ask what I hope to be a bit of a controversial sort of question for the panel. So our first question is from Magnus, who's a master's student at Aarhus University, and who is very interested in the youth participation in the protests and the striking ability of the protests to last as long as it has, as you guys have noticed, and even accumulate power. He's wanting to know how that's happening. What is the mood in terms of fatigue, and why is it that that the protests can grow given the increasing repression taken by the Georgian Dream government? And I will, I think, Tamta, if you could take that one, and maybe Luka, if you can add on, if you have any insights, but I think that best fits y'all's emphasis.
Yes, thank you for this question. And I think the protest has its ups and downs. I wouldn't say that there is no fatigue, and there is like constant anxiety about that it might fade away, the protest, but because of this collective fatigue, which is very much part of the protesters' everyday life. And especially it goes to this anxiety about fading away the protests energy refers to students who are not as active as they were in the beginning of this protest, at least back in spring. So now there are like always this kind of negotiations or talks and discussions about how to activate, for example, students who were so active at some point, and they then after the elections, they were so frustrated and also so tired because of their very active contribution to the protest energy. People are trying to find ways how to kind of energize them again. But I was just thinking also that those who still find energy in and continue blocking, for example, the Rustaveli Avenue every day, and there also you can sense this anxiety of the protest not to kind of stop at some point, is that it is fueled every time by anger. And anger is a very kind of powerful affect, which I think energizes and empowers people again. And with that, I am reminded of the work by Audre Lorde, who wrote a great article about the uses of anger against racism, and how she found this kind of emotion as a way of empowering also herself to fight back. And I think this is somehow what we see also in Georgia, that this anger takes over or replaces sometimes this collective fatigue, which is for sure there.
Thank you, Tamta. Luka, did you have anything to add, or would you like me to move on?
Yeah, I could just briefly add that I wouldn't say that the resistance has waned. Of course, some people might experience some sort of fatigue. We all have that from time to time. But actually, the resistance might be said to have transformed into more solid organizational structures. In sheer numbers, of course, there's a decline compared to those 200,000 that used to come out in December, for example. But there's this qualitative transformation and an ongoing reflection on how to expand the protests, how to include the more vulnerable segments of society that have been excluded from the protests up to now because of many limitations that the social structure imposes on them. But yeah, it's a living effort, and it's the political articulation of grievances is becoming more and more complex and focused and to the point. So yeah, it's in sheer numbers there might be a decline, but qualitatively there's ongoing improvement.
Thank you, Luka. So one of our audience members, Luka, is curious about this the propaganda around the war. So Nutsa, this might be a good question for you. To what extent is this war propaganda credible? To what extent is the threat either of a war on either side, maybe from Russia, maybe from Georgian Dream? I don't know how that would happen. Or even from the opposition, is that actually a credible threat in your opinion? Maybe Luka, and then maybe
Yes, thank you.
Want to weigh in?
Nutsa,
I'm having bad. Am I responding to this one?
You are.
Okay.
And we can hear you.
Yes. Thank you for that question. This is something actually that the discussion that we were having, for instance, with Tamta and also with my colleagues when we were looking at the data. And it seems that's kind of the impression that people have. Now, the threats of war are very real, very credible for everyone in Georgia, because we have the recent history. We're in the region where that threat, and then there's Ukraine war, which aggravated kind of the possibility of that threat. So no one can really assure anyone with certainty that there's not going to be a war when it comes to Russia, especially. And we have the precedents in the region, the very recent, but also our own history. Apart from that, there's this very traumatic experience of 1990s wars, and this is something I think that I just for the first time saw how it acts, the trauma of civil confrontation and internal war on Georgians' kind of precaution in the ways they engage in the protests or in the confrontation against the government. And this was only through this data that I actually saw how implicitly, there is no explicit narrative either coming from the Georgian Dream or from our respondents, but because we saw in the scenario of Georgian Dream winning, we saw the threat of internal turbulence, turmoil, chaos, polarization. These were some of the keywords that were used to describe kind of the possibility of kind of eruption of internal war. It implied this kind of scenario that some people did use the language of revenge, that the Georgian Dream will not rest, that they will not allow the opposition to win. So yes, that, just to be brief, that scenario was there in people's heads, that even if the opposition, even if they were unable to rig the elections the way they did, they would stage some kind of, and these attempts were also visible during the protests, kind of the attempts of staging polarized public confronting one another, so staging counter protests and so forth. And this has been in the playbook of the Georgian Dream for a long time, which were unsuccessful because of how precautious Georgians are and how kind of this trauma also instructs them to be careful in a way. I'm not sure if that responds to the question, but I think it does. Yeah, thank you.
We have another 2 questions, but I'm going to use kind of moderator privilege to ask a question that I'm hesitant to ask. One interesting thing, and it comes from Luka's question, which is, to what extent does the Georgian Dream have the active support of Russia as opposed to a passive support of Russia, or something along those lines? As I've watched the protests, which have gone on for months, something that strikes me is that while the Georgian Dream is using repressive tactics, they're actually also restrained in a way. They're not as repressive as they might be if we look at how Putin might respond to protests, for example. And so in that sense, I'm curious to know the extent to which it doesn't feel to me in terms of, and I could be wrong here, that the Georgian Dream responses are fueled by Russian action rather than the actions of the leadership inside the Georgian Dream and their control over the Georgian security services. So my question is this: is there any way that you guys can imagine the relative restraint of the Georgian Dream in interacting with the protests? Is this a strategic decision or is it a sign of weakness, do you think? And I don't know who to send this to. Anyone who wants to take it. Just I see you unmuted.
Just briefly, it could be a little bit of both. Because unlike Russia, this is the country of 3.5 million at best. It's the kinship and the social network ties work a little differently, and the resources in that way are limited. I mean, the kind of chasm that you can create between the state apparatus that exerting the violence and the people can only be so big because people are connected in Georgia. And then I think they're trying not to push it to the point where you will have a regular policeman rejecting to engage in repressing the protest, for instance. So they're doing it in a way that allows for the regular policeman, for instance, or their people employed in the state apparatus to still have some narrative left for their justification to stand by the regime. And as soon as they push that kind of the red line, then you will have a lot more people who constitute the very managing circle in the administration, in the public sector, but also who are the real force power. And as far as we know from the insider intelligence, the real kind of violent force that could go for anything that they have is just between 500 and 1,000 people. So that's the resource that they have for the kind of militant group that will just do about anything. So I think it's a little bit of both. It's a strategic or tactical decision not to go over the board so that their own structure will be dislocated, as Iya said. Yeah, that's my understanding of it, at least.
Thank you, Nutsa. All right, on the Q&A, Vasil Tskarishvili is asking. It's more of a comment, but I wonder if you guys might give some voice to it. The Georgian constitution, institutions are designed to stop executive aggrandizement, and he's making the point that it seems that the constitution has become a tool of the Georgian Dream government. I wonder if anyone might be willing to comment on that, Luka.
Yeah, well, I think no constitution can protect you from an authoritarian drift on its own, right? Unless there's the corresponding political will and political culture. I mean, look at what Trump and Musk are doing with all these US institutions whose resilience was legendary. But of course, legal scholars who have worked on judiciary reform in Georgia and who have written about this will tell you that Georgian Dream managed to manipulate with, legalist procedures that allowed for certain mechanisms to be put in place without anyone really noticing it, which ultimately enabled Ivanishvili to appoint, for example, all the judges he wanted. And then from then on, everything went downwards.
Understood. Thank you. A final question that's on our list, and we do have a few more minutes if others would like to add some questions, is the question about the kind of political legitimacy of the decision to suspend the EU talks, and curious to know how the Georgian Dream government is defending that, given the overwhelming support for joining the EU that's within the Georgian population. Iya, go ahead. I was going to see if you were willing to take this on.
Yes, sure. I can start, and maybe others want to add. Well, if I understand the question right, it's basically asking whether the Georgian Dream had this legitimacy to suspend the accession talks to the EU, and I think the clear answer there is no, because there have
I
been.
think the question's more like what are they saying to defend it, given the absence of this legitimacy?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So the absence of legitimacy was already in the question. Sorry, I missed that part.
That's
yes.
okay.
So in the beginning, what they were the narrative basically was that this suspension of the talks, it didn't mean the completely cutting ties of with the EU, but they were kind of postponing all this accession process by 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, by several years. And their idea was also that we do want to become part of the EU at some point, but only with dignity. I think Luka had on one of his slides this big banner also, which was on the streets before the elections, and it said towards Europe, but with dignity. And here implicitly the idea was also that as long as the EU is also threatening our sovereignty and telling us what to do and interfering in our internal external affairs, meaning giving us conditionalities. Well, of course, they wouldn't say it, but that's what's meant, right? To become more democratic, to reform the court system, and so on and so forth, because that's all what the Georgian Dream didn't want to do. Then in that case, if the EU accepts us as an equal partner, then we would like to cooperate with them. This was the initial narrative from their side. And yeah, I mean, since most of the people did not really believe into this, and that's why the result of this was this protest, which is still going on. And right now also the second trend is also what Luka was talking about, that the Georgian Dream has now also more actively and explicitly shifted their narrative and discourse, that they are trying to build ties with the EU countries like Hungary and Slovakia, so that there is also different kind of Europe, well, authoritarian Europe, that they want to cooperate with, and this is becoming very dangerous in a way.
Thank you so much. One more. Go ahead, Nutsa. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add, so in their narrative, this other Europe is the one that they want to join, is the one that is not run by the global party, or global war party, and is not trying to drag Georgia into the war. So that was kind of, for their electorate, maybe it was just postponing until the war threat is over. So that was also part of the.
Let me ask one final question, and then we'll need to end the discussion. It seems to me, as someone who has been watching Georgia, but I haven't physically been in Georgia since October before the election, is that the protesters and the opposition forces in Georgia and the Georgian Dream government are talking past each other. That is, that they're both competing for kind of the hearts and minds of the Georgian people who are staying at home, who are not part of the protest, or that they're seeking to different outside players to apply pressure onto one another, right? So the Georgian Dream is reaching out to Orban, is reaching out to different European actors, reaching out for Trump now, maybe reaching out for Putin, whereas many in the Georgian opposition are reaching out to, for example, like the previous administration, Biden, for the sanctions, and other European players that they think would be more sympathetic to that position. But I see very little interaction between the Georgian Dream government and the protesters, or even thinking about what it would be like for Georgian Dream to leave. Is there any safe exit strategy that is available to the Georgian Dream political leadership if they should choose to have new elections or to choose to engage with protester demands? I mean, is there, to your knowledge, is there anybody inside the protest movement or the opposition movement who's trying to create a pathway for them to leave power with dignity?
I will start, and I think then the others can add, because there is no really straightforward answer to that, and then we can't really know but I think the main demands that the protesters themselves are now posing, these are if these demands are actually realized or implemented by the Georgian Dream government, this is the safe exit for them as well, which is basically to appoint the elections and to release the political prisoners, which have been kept in prison for months now. So these two, and I think all the protesters agree that this would be also the safe exit for the Georgian Dream government. And the what I find exciting about this protest is exactly that people on the protest side who seem to be very radical are ready for those kinds of concessions to continue to build the democratic society. This is just one answer to that. Another, you mentioned something about how the opposition is trying to reach out, whether it's trying to reach out to other political kind of actors than just Trump and Orban in Europe or in the US, and to legitimize or to seek help from them. I think Georgia, what we see and what many peripheral countries also undergo is this kind of that it doesn't have a luxury somehow to not to talk to people who are in charge of making decisions in those kind of global power structures. So I think even like Salome Zurabishvili, who is a former president of Georgia, but really for protesters acting as a legitimate president, is trying to reach out to the current Trump administration and draw attention from them in order to secure the democracy of Georgia and democratic transition in Georgia.
All right. If anyone else have any final words, I will draw our discussion to a close.
No, I think we all agree with Tamta on that. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for such an interesting and informed panel. We really appreciate you taking the time in your evening to come to us on our noon to present your very important work. And thanks again to Harriman, and thanks again to Will for his introduction, for giving us the opportunity to speak to everyone today. Thank to our attendees for staying with us the entire time. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for inviting us.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.